welcome to the State of the Nation. Joining me today is Chief Economist from Stanlib, Mr. Kevin Lings. Kevin, welcome back to the State of the Nation.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, it's good to have you back here. The last time we spoke quite some time ago, but the reason that we wanted to talk is that we've recently had a midterm budget announcement, and that's done in the backdrop of a country struggling financially. And this being South Africa, there was a lot of talk as to what steps are going to be taken, but the minister didn't make too many graceful or brave steps, did he?
No, there was no innovation in the document whatsoever, nothing that's really going to take the country forward. This is about trying to deal with the immediate problems and trying to get the fiscal position into better shape. It's clearly deteriorated substantially over the last year. So the criticism, there are lots of criticisms, but one of which would be there's nothing in this document that is materially going to lift the growth rate in South Africa in the foreseeable future, nor is there anything in this document that will expand employment, will grow the tax base, will really put fiscal position in a substantial, better space. If you look at the minister's own forecast for the next 3 years, he doesn't have the economy growing at more than 2%. So think about all of the speeches you've heard from government officials, including the president. Think about all of the promises, and all of that culminates in an economy that, according to the Minister of Finance, is not going to grow by more than 2% over the next 3 years. The problem with 2% is the population grows at 1.6%. So you barely standing still. You're not going to create significant jobs. You're not going to create significant capacity. You're not going to improve the tax base. You're not going to encourage a hell of a lot of stuff that you should be encouraging. So what you want to see is something that is going to take the growth rate up to 3%, 4%, 5%. We've had that before. Take it up to that level and then sustain it at that level. It is achievable with the right policies, but we're simply not moving ahead in a substantive way. The budget was really about trying to arrest the decline, trying to stop the deterioration, try and put it on a better footing, see if we can at least do that, and then try and move forward from that. So in that sense, disappointing.
So if he was trying to at least put the fiscal position on a better footing, was that achieved?
Not in the last year, no. It's deteriorated, right? So government has got themselves into the situation where they know they've got to effect fiscal discipline or fiscal consolidation. They know that. They've themselves highlighted that. The credit rating agencies continue to highlight that. And they promise that they will do that, right? But if you look at it over the last year, you had another step deterioration. In particular, obviously, the debt level. Now the minister's saying over the next 3 years, debt is going to 77% of GDP. He was previously saying it's going to peak at 73%. 73% we were concerned about. 77 is a step change in the wrong direction. And clearly that tells you pretty much everything you need to know about the state of government finances. The interest cost on that debt is going to jump up further. It's going to go to 22% of total tax revenue. That's enormous. That really restricts the government's ability to spend money in critical areas. You've lost 22% of your tax revenue just on interest before you started, before you've done anything in terms of trying to improve the economy. That's a significant deterioration. You've obviously over time allowed your expenditure to move more into consumption-related activity, salaries, social payments, and less in terms of infrastructure. And now we find ourselves in a position where we're lacking the infrastructure, but we need the infrastructure to get the growth rate, to get the employment, to get the tax revenue. So we've become trapped. There are ways out of that. Those ways would involve allowing the private sector to get substantially more involved in the economy. To government's credit, they are allowing that in the energy sector, and where they've allowed that, private sector's responded. Private sector has invested in energy and will invest significantly more in energy, and over time I think that will help us. But you've got to do the same in the railway system, the same in the port system, the same in the water, sanitation, pretty much. all of where state-owned enterprises operate, the only clear way forward is to get the private sector more involved. Government, I think, knows that. They've moved in that direction, but they're not rushing in that direction. And it feels to us that you've got to get to that point of crisis. And when you're at that point of crisis, then government says, okay, what's the plan now? Let's get the private sector involved. That happened with energy, and it looks to me like that's happening with Transnet and the railway system. You can see the deterioration in the goods moved on the railway system, the loss of revenue in terms of export capacity. Now we're at a point of crisis. You're going to see private sector being asked to step into the railway, etc. That's fine, but we're waiting too long before we make those decisions, and we need to be on the front foot. And when I look at the medium-term budget, there isn't enough of that forward thinking. There isn't enough of that, let's really get on top of this, let's make the critical changes, let's be bold, and let's get this economy going. Some of which you can understand because you're going into an election year, right? So you don't want to make critical changes that involve restructuring government departments, involve cutting down government employment, anything like that. You're not going to do that in an election year. But it's very clear that growth is the key ingredient that's missing in South Africa.
Let's put this into numbers that we can understand. Sure. Out of every 5 tax rands that we collect, we are throwing away 1.
Yes.
Right, and that's into interest payments.
Yes.
Just to get a sense of what we're doing. We're getting nothing for 22% of the money we collect. That's just going straight back to people who we owe the money to.
That's right, yes.
We're paying interest of over R1 billion a day.
Sure.
Right. That's R1 billion per day, including Saturdays and Sundays and public holidays, which we're quite fond of. And we're taking that money, we're throwing it away.
Yes. So what could you do with that money?
Yeah. Okay.
An enormous amount.
Right. So we are really giving ourselves no realistic chance of getting out of it with the current medium-term budget, the current budgetary spending pattern of the state.
No, no. That's why it's a holding budget. It's trying to do what you can in the short term. So you end up, when you kind of go through all the numbers and you sit down and you think about it, you end up with this as your fundamental conclusion.
Yes.
So the first part of the conclusion says we can't afford the government we've got. We're only growing this economy at 1% or barely above 1%. We're hardly growing the tax base. We're not generating enough tax revenue to afford the public sector we've got. We know that because every year the debt goes up substantially, and every year the cost of that debt goes up substantially. Over the long term, over the medium term, it is unaffordable. So we can't afford the government we've got. Having recognized that, now we've got 2 choices, and we've got to pick one of them. We either grow this economy substantially faster, and 1.5% is not substantially faster. I'm talking 3%, 4%, 5%. So you either find a way to grow this economy faster. Then if you do that, yes, you can afford the government you've got because the tax base will rise and you'll be able to pay for a lot of this easier than you can do at the moment. Or you restructure the public sector, you cut it down, you cut down departments, you cut down the size of the cabinet, and you trim the public sector to fit your tax base. Yeah. Those are the choices you've got, right? If you look at the minister, what did he say? You can see he's recognizing that. And so he's saying over the next 3 years, we'll have to effect some consolidation of government spending around departments. And he's recognizing that government is too big given the small tax base. So he at this stage will have to move in that direction. But is there the political will to make the key changes that will put the public sector or right-size the public sector to fit with the tax base? You'd be skeptical about that. Equally, are there the key changes in place that can lift the growth rate to 4%? No. So you're stuck. And being stuck is a terrible place for an economy like South Africa.
We're going to get a few comments. We're going to have some people that are watching us right now that are going to say, yes, but America operates at a budget shortfall of 126% of GDP, yes, if I'm not mistaken, right? Please explain why the US can do it and why South Africa is having a hard time at 77%.
So the difference is your interest cost. It's not about your total debt, right? There are many countries that have a lower debt level than South Africa and are in financial difficulty. There are many countries that have a substantially higher debt level and are not in financial difficulty, right? You can go to Japan, the debt level is, a couple of 100 times GDP. They're not in an absolute financial crisis. They still have a decent credit rating. Most of Europe, if you look at most of Europe, their government debts are up at 100% of GDP. There are some that are higher than 100%. What is the cost of that debt? What is the interest cost of that debt? And so in South Africa, our interest rate is significantly higher than where the US is on average. Obviously, US bond yields have gone up more recently, and you've got, say, the 10-year bond yield where it approaches 5%. Our number is more, 11, 12%, so significantly higher. The 5% for the US would be on the high side. Longer term, they would expect to have that 10-year cost of money more like around 3%, 4%, right? So you're comparing what should be in the US at a 3 to 4% interest rate as a kind of trend line versus a South Africa trend line, which would be about 8 or 9%. That's substantially, it's almost 3 times the interest cost, which means the debt that you've got, you're paying substantially more interest. It's never about the total debt. It's always about, can you afford the debt you've got? The same thing would apply in your personal sector, right? There's nothing that says that somebody can't have a huge amount of debt in their personal capacity if they can afford it, if they've got the income to pay for that debt. The problem for South Africa is that if you go back to when Trevor Manuel was Minister of Finance, right? He left in 2009. Back in 2009, government debt was 23% of GDP. It's now going to 77%. Back in 2009, the interest cost on government debt was 7% of total tax revenue. 7%, it's approaching 22%. Now that is the deterioration that is problematic, right? That can happen as long as you can look at a country and you can show what did you use that debt for. So I was doing some work on China. China over the last 10 years is certainly, if not the fastest, one of the fastest growing countries that are becoming indebted. In other words, their level of debt that they've taken on in the last 10 years is phenomenal. They have now become more indebted than the United States. Huge increase in debt. The difference is, if you go to China and you say to yourself, show me where you used this debt. Show me what you did with this money. It's on display. The infrastructure is on display, the buildings are on display, the network, the railway system, the airport system, all on display. You can clearly see what they used their debt for, and those assets are going to be around for many decades. Cost you a lot of money, but you've delivered the infrastructure that will give you the growth over the next 20 years, and so you're going to grow into this. If I did the same thing for South Africa, I said, we went from 23% of GDP to 77%. Show me, demonstrate. You can't do that. You're going to show in every area a decay in the road network, rail network, port network, show a decay in the water, the sanitation. Then you have to say, what did you do with the money? You squandered it. And you squandered it, and now you're sitting with that debt, and you still need the infrastructure, which means going forward, you're going to have to spend more money. Massive difference. So it's the total debt that you've got. Can you afford the debt? And what the hell did you do with the debt? South Africa has got the worst combination. We squandered the money we took on as debt, and now we've obviously got an interest cost that is way too high.
Now, Kevin, we also have a few big soccer stadiums we can show you, right, that get at least 200 or 300 people per South African Premier soccer match. So, let's look at South Africa's place in the world.
Yeah.
Because, it's very hard to see where any industrial growth will come from. It can't keep the lights on. Yeah. So that immediately curbs industrial growth. We can't transport anything. Our ports are rated the worst in the world, so it's hard for us to export. Very, very ugly picture emerging here, unless we have a commodities boom. Now, on the commodities boom, once again, just to keep people informed, we have enjoyed a commodities boom.
Yes.
Which we didn't quite exploit to the best, but at least it was there.
Yes.
Right? And that's really what bailed us out over the last sort of 5 or 6 years.
Sure.
Was the fact that we are getting revenue for minerals dug out of the ground, even though we did it inefficiently and to a far lesser degree than what we could have. But commodity boom looks like it's shelved for now because our mines have become even less competitive.
Yeah.
Now, Kevin, we are not alone in this. The global backdrop is not rosy at the moment. Suddenly war has broken out where we've been at peace. That has always got a massive economic cost.
Yeah.
Is South Africa starting to look a bit like Argentina?
So we're heading in that direction. We're not at that point, right? And that's critical. The deterioration is evident, and it's evident across a range of metrics. You can look at the unemployment rate, you can look at income inequality, you can look at education outcomes, you can look at health outcomes, you can look at just the growth rate, the debt level. There are many metrics that will show you that South Africa has deteriorated, and that this deterioration continues on in a lot of key areas. So the question is, are we at a point of an absolute crisis? Are we a failed state? Are we about to be a failed state? Are we going to need significant external support in terms of IMF bailouts, etc., all of that? The answer is no, we haven't. The deterioration hasn't gone to that level yet. But what is very clear is there is a trend that has emerged, and that trend continues on, and the deterioration is evident. And if you only grow the economy by, let's say, the minister's right. Let's assume the minister's right. If you only grow the economy at 1 to 2% over the next 3 years, the deterioration will continue. The social dynamics of this country are so that you can't expect that if you're only growing at 1 to 2%, that this deterioration is going to be reversed, right? So that's the problem. The problem is you're not doing enough to ensure that you're not Argentina or Venezuela or a range of other similar countries, and so that makes people naturally anxious. We can see where we've got to stop the deterioration. The electricity is first and foremost, but it's not just electricity. And we can see that there are efforts to do that, right? And some of that is showing some progress. But there's a hell of a lot of work you've got to do in almost every area. And so I think it's right to warn, to highlight these issues, because you don't want to sleepwalk your way into failure. You need to know the path you're on, and you need to know that this path, unless you intervene, unless you make critical changes, this path will lead you down the wrong road. And that's where South Africa's at. And that's why we get so worked up about this and so anxious about it. We don't want it to go to that point. I keep saying there are things you can do. And those things are primarily government needs to partner with the private sector. The private sector, when we look at it, corporates in South Africa are good. They're well managed, they've got decent balance sheets, they sit with expertise, they get involved in their own business, but if you allow them the opportunity to expand and get involved in lifting the country, we know they would do that. Many corporates have expressed exactly that. So the answer is very clear. Use the private sector's balance sheet, get the private sector involved, and you'll be amazed at the benefits that they can deliver for South Africa, because they stand to lose a huge amount. South African corporates are not exiting South Africa. They're not closing up and, oh, I'm moving out. That's not the case. The corporate balance sheet looks incredibly strong. So use it to the benefit of the country. And yes, corporates will benefit, and rich people will get richer. So what? That's for the benefit of the country. At the moment, we're sleepwalking our way into an economic failure, and 1 to 2% growth is just not good enough in our circumstance.
I've been very outspoken about businesses that stepped in to assist government recently. And I've made it absolutely clear that I think it's a disastrous idea.
Okay.
Right? Purely because, corporate South Africa run the country to the detriment of all other businesses. And it'll just grow the monopolistic way that business is conducted in South Africa. You think that corporates going out there to bail out a government that has failed, knowingly, willingly. Even now, we've had the minister tell his own cabinet what was going to happen, and yet they still wouldn't take the medicine that they need to take. Are you suggesting that corporates must go and bail out the ANC so they can win the next election?
No, I'm not suggesting that at all.
Because that's a net result, isn't it?
Yes, no, I'm not suggesting that at all. Because that suggests a political motive. So let's go to Pier, let me illustrate what I think is a good thing. Go to Pier 2 Harbour, Durban. As you say, Pier 2 Harbour, one of the worst performing harbours in the world, technically not the worst. If you look at the latest survey, they're the 6th worst performing harbour in the world, and there's something like almost 400 container ports in the world, and they get surveyed once a year. So Durban, unquestionably, a highly inefficient port, and it's costing South Africa a fortune, and government said, we're going to get the private sector involved in the management, not the ownership of the port, but in the management of the port. They put it out to tender. Eventually the tender got approved, and they approved a Philippines company based in Manila. Not a South African company. The reason I think is simple. South African companies don't really have expertise at running ports. The Manila company, or the Philippines company, I think operates 38 ports around the world very successfully. They took it on. They're willing to get involved. Now, obviously that deal has to be fully bedded down, but the idea is exactly right. The Pier 2 Harbour, which is South Africa's biggest container area, gets ring-fenced into a separate entity. Government owns 51%. The Philippines company owns 49%. And the Philippines company invests in the port in terms of upgrading some of the infrastructure. And they get paid for that. They get paid to operate, an operational fee, 100%, and they're happy with that operational fee. Now, is that the type of thing I think South Africa could benefit from? Yes. You're bringing in international expertise that knows how to run a port. I'm convinced they'll run that port the way they run their 38 other ports. I'm convinced they'll make a profit doing it, because that's what they're in business to do. And if they do that for the Pier 2 container and they're successful, South Africa gains. All of South African business gains, because you've got better efficiency in your port, you've got a better import and export balance. South Africa's unusual. When the Philippines company looked at South Africa, they said the unusual thing is that we have an equal amount of containers coming in as we do going out. We are a very high intensity import and export country, and they think they can make a significant difference. That's the type of thing I'm suggesting. I'm not suggesting that private sector moves in and says, we will assist, we will take on the pain, or anything like that.
Where you've got Neil Froneman, I'll run the police now, even though you've got a Minister of Police.
No, not suggesting that. And quite frankly, where the private sector has got involved in trying to do those sort of things, it's been a failure. So no, not in any way. Look at each entity in isolation and decide what is the best way to run this entity. It's not about ownership. It's not about outright control. It's about, can we run a port effectively? Government needs to own up and say, we truly don't have that level of expertise. Let's get the operators in that can do it. We'll pay them a fair cost, a fair fee for that, and we get a world-class port, something that we can be proud of. I would argue you can do exactly the same thing for the railway system. Get the private sector to operate the railway line, to make sure the railway line is running. Why? Because they benefit. Take the manganese railway line. Get the mining company to run the manganese railway line. They'll be thrilled, because they're going to get much more manganese exports, and you put a lot of that burden onto the private sector. Does the private sector own the railway line? No, they're the operator of the railway line. The ownership rests with government. And I'm saying if you do that and you selectively get private sector involved in these initiatives, you can start to ease the pressure in the system. I wouldn't go and do it for every single thing. It becomes messy. But on critical areas, the private sector can make a difference.
What about state-owned companies?
So when you look at the SOEs, there's no doubt that government wants to retain ownership of the SOEs, and they're going to do a lot to maintain that ownership. And I think if they if they changed that, they themselves would have huge feedback, huge pushback from their electorate and their support base. And if I look at what the president said most recently, he said unequivocally that we will retain ownership of Transnet. They're not about to privatize Transnet or sell the assets, etc. But there's a model that government is working on that says we can have private operators that come in, that provide a service, and we own the entity. And I would say it's exactly the same thing with solar plants, right? So you go to the private sector, you say you want to build a solar plant, you build a solar plant, you feed it into the grid, you get paid for the solar energy you produce. I don't see what's wrong with that. Everybody wins, everybody's happy with that, you're getting more energy. Ultimately, government still owns Eskom. Government will always own Eskom as far as I can see. So on these things, to alleviate the pressure, get the private sector involved, get their expertise, get their funding involved. And what that does is it gives the country a fighting chance to try and get on the road to success.
Kevin, I would suggest perhaps we're actually on the right track, right? A highly inefficient government, trying to run things that they shouldn't be running. And what we're actually seeing across sectors, I mean, I'm not exactly being some kind of mystic here, is privatization by stealth.
Yeah.
The hollowing out of this organization that the government wants to keep control of. And the best example, I suppose, has been SAA.
Yes.
They still own it.
Yes.
It barely flies any planes. We all, if we want to book a flight, we book with a whole lot of other carriers, be it domestic or international. And it's happened to government rather than by government or with government's approval. Do you not think that it's worth the short-term pain? Letting the government keep hold of these SOEs. They're going to run them into the ground. We're seeing that with Eskom. They're never going to fix it. We see that with Eskom. We see it with Transnet. And soon enough, we will just work around them.
So that's happening in part, right? You can see that there are various pockets of that. Various towns, various parts of cities are stepping in and simply saying, we're going to provide the services because these services are non-functional and we're going to do that. And to some extent, that's already been happening. If you look at security, take the security industry, there's more people employed in private security than in the police. Yeah. And so essentially the private sector is doing exactly that. And there are many examples of that. And there's nothing, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. The problem I can see for the state-owned enterprises is that by government holding on to dysfunctional entities and not fixing them, it costs you a fortune. The amount of money, billions of rands that you keep throwing in every year and you keep hurting the budget and you keep taking that money, you give the post office another 4 billion, another 3 billion. That money you could have used for something much, much more beneficial. And so this process, think about how much money Eskom cost us, how much money Transnet's cost us. It's a massive exercise. We can't afford it. So you're better off in terms of your fiscal position, the use of taxpayers' money. You're better off trying to cut the loss, trying to say enough and no more. We've got to put this into better shape. We've got to restructure it. It's clear that the restructuring is going to be that the entity is not what it was previously, and that over time this restructuring will scale down the size, get the private sector involved, and maybe give us a chance to move forward. To allow that entity to simply fail, that then opens the space for the private sector to move in, is a very, very expensive exercise. Could take many years. And I just worry that we don't have the money or the time for that process to play out.
Let's look forward. You know, we've sketched a fairly gloomy scenario, and that's fairly easy to do because it is what it is. Is there any hope?
So let me give you the scenario. Let me give you the upside scenario, and this is what's in play at the moment. So you've got three things that may give you a little bit more economic activity a little bit more vibrancy in the economy over the next 2 years. All right, three things. The first is you can see that there's more energy availability. Kusile is systematically being put back online. I think Medupi Unit 4 will be finished next year. I think that Koeberg's power station refurbishment, I think that will be finished during the course of next year. It is possible that by the time you get to end of next year, load shedding is significantly less than what you've got now. And we know from the data and from various studies that if you can stop load shedding or cut it back dramatically, you'll get more economic activity. Is it a game changer? No, it's at the margin. It makes the country feel better. It lifts confidence, gets activity going, and it would be a more positive situation. Absolutely, right? The second thing that would help you is during the course of next year, you cut interest rates. Now, we feel that we're getting to the top of the global interest rate cycle. It feels like the US is probably at the top. It feels like Europe is at the top. It feels like many emerging markets are slowly starting to cut rates. It feels like South Africa is at the top of its interest rate cycle. So let's assume that during the course of next year, particularly second half of next year, you start to cut interest rates around the world, including in South Africa. Those cuts continue into 2025. The act of cutting interest rates is a natural stimulus for most economies. There's no reason why that shouldn't be the case in South Africa. The third thing is that having an election boosts the economy, right? If you look at the Independent Electoral Commission, every time we have an election, they employ over 200,000 people to run the election. Those people get paid. Political parties run around telling everybody how good they are. Posters are printed, advertisements. It actually is quite a lot of money that gets spent. So if you do those three things, you have an election and the election goes okay, we can worry about the outcome, but the election process is okay. You cut interest rates and you ease load shedding, you can get the growth rate up to 2%. And you can do that over the next 2 years. The difficulty with it is obviously it's not 3% or 4%. And if you want to do 3% or 4%, you need a lot more that you've got to put in place. And so there's a difference between a cyclical economic upswing, which I think South Africa will have over the next 2 years, a business cycle cyclical upswing helped by cutting interest rates, helped by an easing of load shedding, versus a structural improvement in South Africa's long-term economic growth. No, we're not doing enough yet to say there's going to be a structural uplift. We've got to ease the pressure in many key areas. Infrastructure, obvious, including energy and transport, but then we've got to do other stuff. We've got to get a better education outcome and a whole range of things around healthcare and water and sanitation, etc. So there's a shopping list of the things you need to do to get a structural uplift. But I would be confident that we can have an economic business cycle upswing over the next 2 years off a very low base this year. The economy is growing at less than 1%. Expectations 0.8, 0.9. The base is low. So I think we could go into a better feel. The question is, have we got the political will in that better feel environment to make the right structural changes to put the economy on a better growth path longer term? That's going to be the real challenge.
A couple of months back, I did some work at the BRICS Summit, and I got the distinct feeling that many within the ruling party and the government were pinning their hopes on the change to a multipolar world, as they were calling it, and the end of Western hegemony, right, which is being sort of touted from the top of the rooftops. What is your opinion of that? Do you think, I mean, clearly the world has moved from the unipolar situation where we only do everything with America and in dollars. Do you think there's an opportunity there for a country like South Africa?
My strong advice would be don't pick sides. In other words, we in the last while have tended to pick sides, and the side we've picked is a Russia-China grouping, right? And we can see evidence of that. We did military exercises with Russia. The lady our ship told us we'd pick sides. We're in the BRICS summit with them. We clearly have good relationships with China and Russia. The problem might be that you pick the wrong side, right? If you look at China's growth rate, it's not what it used to be. They've got some difficulties of their own. And it's not a guarantee that China's prosperity will continue on. They've got to meet some key challenges. You don't want to, at the same time, then alienate the United States, because you've got the AGOA agreement, and the AGOA agreement is useful, particularly for the motor industry. And there's no doubt that having an alliance with, say, Europe is beneficial for us in terms of we send a lot of exports into Europe. So I would say that for South Africa, we want to make sure that we're neutral, that we genuinely don't pick sides, that we will trade with anybody who's out there. We don't want to South Africa is a small open economy. Don't get involved in the fight between the United States and China. You're going to be lost in that battle. You're not a key player. Sit on the sideline, don't pick sides, and look for genuine opportunities to do business with whoever is willing to do business. I don't believe that we are in a powerful enough position to alienate any potential trade partner. So when I look at the recent developments, I worry that we pick sides too easily, that we say from a political point of view that we're neutral, but the reality suggests something else. We've got the AGOA summit happening this week in Johannesburg. We'll see how that works out. It looks like we're still on sides with the US, and I would say that's good. Stay on sides with the US, stay on sides with China, and use all of that to the benefit of the domestic economy.
Well, Kevin, thank you so much for sharing the picture with us today. There's a lot for us to consider. South Africa is in a very difficult position, and it's a government that will not make those difficult decisions. We heard the same from the previous finance minister about the choices that we need to make. He failed to make the choices and sort of slunk off back to Mkhuba's Kloof, so we haven't heard from him other than watching a few cooking videos. So let's just hope that South Africa starts making a few better decisions. But to everybody that joined us today, you have made a great decision by joining us today. So if you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the State of the Nation channel. And remember, we will be doing a live State of the Nation event at the end of November 2023, and I hope you'll join us. There'll be more details below this video. To Kevin Lings, thank you so much for joining us. To everybody out there, have a great day ahead.